Italy threatens Egypt with immediate action if it fails to help uncover the truth behind the murder of an Italian student in Cairo. The handling of the case has prompted accusations of a cover-up by Cairo. How far might the diplomatic row escalate? What does the case tell us about the rule of law in Egypt? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. It's a case that has shocked and outraged Italians. Giulio Regeni was an Italian student who went missing in Cairo after speaking to trade union and opposition activists. But his mutilated body was later found on the side of a road. It appeared to have been tortured. What followed was, for many Italians, a botched investigation, one that some have concluded amounts to a cover-up. We'll discuss the details with our guests in just a moment. But first, Sonia Gallego reports from Rome, where an Egyptian delegation has arrived to discuss the case.
Behind me in Rome's police academy, the Egyptian delegation has been meeting with Italian prosecutors to discuss details surrounding the murder of Giulio Regeni, the Italian student who was found murdered in a ditch just outside of Cairo. Now, in that meeting, there has been a dossier of 2,000 pages presented that contains testimonies from some 200 witnesses. And it's a case which has aroused a lot of emotion here in Italy. The case of an Italian student who was just conducting his studies and found murdered there. And the Italian people in turn have been exerting more pressure on the Italian government to do something about finding out the truth behind this murder. The Italian government now seems to be exerting more pressure and taking a more decisive stance to the Egyptian government, saying that there would be repercussions if there wasn't an attempt to try and find out the truth behind this case. Also, Prime Minister Renzi said that the Italian people were owed the truth as to what really happened to Giulio Regeni.
Well, as we've mentioned, the international outcry over Regeni's case is largely related to the pace of the investigation so far. It's been more than 2 months since he went missing on January the 25th. That was the 5th anniversary of the Egyptian revolution. Regeni's body was found about a week later with signs of torture. Initially, investigators suggested he died in a traffic accident. But an Italian autopsy said he'd been killed slowly with cigarette burns, multiple stab wounds and electrocution. At the end of March, Egyptian officials offered another explanation for Regeni's killing. They said police had killed 4 alleged gang members responsible for his death. Italian investigators and human rights groups have been sceptical of that theory. This week, Italian media, citing a source in the Egyptian intelligence services, have been reporting that Egyptian authorities themselves were involved in Regeni's death. Let's bring our guests into the show then. We have in London Nicolas Piachaud, Egypt researcher at Amnesty International. In Rome, Raffaele Marchetti, Professor of International Relations at Lewis University. And also in London, Wafik Moustafa, founder and chairman of the British Arab Network. Good to have you all in the show. If I could start with Wafik. Wafik, when we compare perhaps this case to others where foreigners have been murdered around the world, would you say Egyptian authorities have been slow to investigate this one?
It's certainly the Egyptian authorities has been stalling in providing information. Nonetheless, the murder of Regeni have shone the light on systemic human rights abuses record in Egypt. It has been a big case, and the Egyptian authority trying to cover it up with many stories, and of course are not compliant with the request of the Italian authorities about certain names, and they're not sharing information about exactly what happened, about the CCTV
Let's get into that point if we could, Wafik. Why do you think Egyptian authorities haven't handed over things which have been requested, like the closed-circuit television footage, like Regeni's telephone records and so on?
I think there is a huge cover-up at the highest level, and I've been reading it in Arabic and English stories. It does not add up at any time, and particularly the autopsy have proven he has been killed after a period of severe torture, and which bears the hallmarks of the Egyptian security police, how they torture other Egyptians. Exactly, it was not just a random killing. It was a typical torture case inside Egypt, which have been exposed to all the world.
All right, let me try and play devil's advocate here for a moment with Raffaele. Egyptian authorities would say they've worked very hard on this case. They say that they've even tracked down a criminal gang. They found that they were responsible for Regeni's murder. They found, they say, some of Regeni's belongings at one of the gang members' house. Why has that story been met with so much skepticism in Italy?
Well, because that doesn't match with the few details that the Italian investigative group, who was in Cairo for almost a month, managed to collect. So the kind of information that have been provided simply are inconsistent with the other facts and investigative materials that have been gathered by the Italian police and investigations.
How does it contradict what the Italians have found?
Well, I mean, for instance, I mean, the signs of torture that were clear out of the autopsy of the body clearly suggests that this has not been a car accident or a petty criminality accident, but those are signs that are very much in line with professional way of torturing victims, which, by the way, correspond to other kinds of torturing signals or signs of other people tortured in Egypt and elsewhere. So in that sense, this is definitely not a case of petty criminality. It is a professional job to some extent.
All right, since we're on the issue of torture, let's bring in Nicholas into the discussion. The official narrative says that this is a gang that supposedly, we're told, targets foreigners, was trying to get money perhaps out of abducting Regeni. When you look at the sort of things which Raffaele was talking about, the marks on his body, do they offer any clues as to who might have been responsible for his death? And, you know, is it easy to draw that sort of conclusion?
Look, I mean, I think these fantastic explanations, you know, offered by Egypt's authorities, first that he was killed in a car accident, then that he was abducted by some kind of sadomasochistic gang. I mean, they've completely failed to explain these very disturbing similarities between, you know, Giulio Regeni's disappearance, torture and murder, and this pattern of enforced disappearances in Egypt. I mean, Amnesty International has been documenting hundreds of enforced disappearances since last March. That's when a new interior minister was installed, and we saw Egypt's security forces move from crushing protests on the streets to snatching people from their homes and torturing them in secret detention. I mean, human rights groups in Egypt have been documenting between, say, 90 to 100 reports of such enforced disappearances a month, following a very similar set of things that happened to Giulio Regeni.
How similar then, Nicholas? Take us through the similarities. When your organisation researches, as you say, and you find these similarities, what are they?
Okay, let's look at the facts as we know them. He disappeared at a time of intensive police crackdown in downtown Cairo. The police said that they had searched around 5,000 apartments in the lead up to the date in which he disappeared. He was then unable to contact his family, his lawyers, and then his body was discovered 9 days later, 22 kilometers away, again in a heavily policed highway, I think near some police checkpoints. I mean, the similarities there are greatly disturbing. I mean, the same month that Giulio Regeni disappeared, I believe 2 other activists similarly disappeared and were later found in the morgue with bullet wounds and signs of torture.
Very disturbing indeed. Wafik, we understand that Giulio was in Egypt researching the activities of trade unions. How sensitive a subject is that in today's Egypt?
Well, Egypt is basically turning into a brutal police state and becoming oversensitive about any material comes out of Egypt through someone like this young man, Julian. And I think that's why they just want to destroy this man, and they killed him in the way we've seen it. And there are many hundreds of young Egyptian men and ladies being disappeared and killed the same way, or reappeared in court, or resurfaced in prison, or resurfaced in courts. It's very confused, chaotic situation inside Egypt where there's no security and family could just not see the son or daughter again once they leave in the morning. And this house has been raided as well. People are not identifying themselves.
Right. Well, let me jump in here. We know that part of the story, but my question is really about the trade unions. They have played a role, haven't they, in the revolution in Egypt? Is it still a sensitive issue, especially for a foreigner, to go into Egypt and start researching that subject?
Oh, certainly it is. It's a very sensitive issue for a foreigner, because you know, a foreigner going to talk and write abroad, and they're trying to give a different narrative to what's happening inside Egypt, and which actually happened in this very unfortunate case.
I'll come back to Nicholas. The very chaotic situation in Egypt was a sentence used there by Wafik a minute ago, and it does raise the question not only of the human rights situation, which both of you have talked about in Egypt, but what does it say about the due process of investigation in Egypt, your ability to rely on an independent, credible, investigative authority to get to the bottom of this, not only for Giulio, but as you mentioned, also for the many other cases of disappearance?
I mean, there are effectively no independent and effective criminal investigations happening in Egypt right now. I mean, that's very clear from this case. I mean, let's remember that the official charged with investigating this case reportedly has a prior conviction for torturing someone to death. I mean, that's the contempt with which Egypt's authorities hold this case. But, on a wider level, judicial authorities have completely ignored gross human rights violations by the security forces, including torture and enforced disappearances. Instead, prosecutors and courts have focused on bringing grossly unfair mass trials in which we've seen hundreds of people sentenced to death and life imprisonment for charges like protesting without authorization. I mean, this is a criminal justice system which is spiraling rapidly out of control and which is unable to deliver, effective, independent and impartial investigations. But I think, to follow on from that, this is now being challenged by the international community. I mean, the explanations offered so far by Egypt's police for what happened to Giulio Regeni, well, Giulio Regeni's family isn't buying them, Italy's government isn't buying them, and it doesn't look like many people in the international community are buying them either. So I think there's real pressure now on Egypt to come up with the truth.
All right, no one's buying them. Raffaele, we understand an Egyptian delegation is in Italy. What do they need to say or do right now for Italian authorities to buy it, to use the words there of Nicholas?
Well, first of all, it's very important that at last they arrived in Italy. They were expected a few days ago, and then the meeting was postponed several times, but finally they came here. This is already a positive sign. I mean, in principle, in words, they have always said that they are willing to cooperate, but then in practice, the cooperation has been always almost minimal or non-existent. So the fact that they are here, this is a first important step. Now the issue is what they are going to deliver and to provide, what kind of materials they are going to provide to the Italian team. They brought many pages of documents, from what we know, more than 2,000 pages. But quantity might not be quality in this case. Italian investigation team, they want CCTV recording and the cell tables for mobiles communication in those areas. We don't know yet if these kind of materials have been delivered.
Raffaele, it sounds almost like the Italians have lost confidence in the Egyptian investigative authorities. Do you think they'll be pushing to play a bigger role in the investigation and not have to rely so much on Egyptian authorities? Do you think that'll be one of the Italian demands?
Well, so far, yes, the level of trust is very low. This is clear. And the repeated attempt of providing incredible sort of interpretations have decreases the level of trust into the Egyptian authorities. But of course, it's very difficult for the Italian team to conduct proper investigation without the cooperation of the Egyptian authorities. It might be even illegal without their authorization. So the Italian team, it's really constrained into them. Italian team needs the cooperation of the Egyptian counterparts. Italy cannot go alone on this case.
Talking about going alone, Nicholas, there was, after the initial coup against the Morsi government, there was a lot of criticism and caution around the world in dealing with the current regime in power in Cairo. That situation seems to have changed. How is that reflected in the human rights situation, in the rule of law situation within Egypt, as the international community or members of it seem to have more or less embraced the situation in Egypt?
For years, really, the international community has overlooked these gross human rights violations in Egypt, really in favor of closer trade ties, of arms sales. If to take you back to what happened in August 2013, when security forces killed up to 1,000 people in a single day, when they dispersed supporters of Mohamed Morsi who were staging protest camps. The international community then really did very little, and I think that sent the political message to Egypt's authorities that they can continue with a policy of all-out repression. And I think the international community is now paying for that silence. What will be interesting looking forward is that now states realize that their nationals' lives are on the line, whether they're prepared to stand up to Egypt's authorities. I think Egypt's international credibility is really on the line here, and it'll be really interesting to see in the coming days and weeks what these proportionate responses that Italy's government talked about were.
That's a great point, and I was going to say, let's take that actually to Raffaele. What sort of immediate, I think was the word that the foreign minister used, immediate and proportionate measures, what do you think they might be that Italy is considering taking if it's not satisfied with the way those talks in Rome go?
Well, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs hasn't sort of clarified what kind of repercussions. We could expect a number of repercussions in economic terms, like putting Egypt in the kind of blacklist or dangerous list of countries to visit, so damaging tourism, which is already on the decline in Egypt. There might be diplomatic repercussions, like calling back the Italian ambassador from Cairo to Rome. But of course, another kind of political pressure. But then there is a bigger political game, which has two sides from the Italian perspective. On the one hand, Italy is the second most important trade partner of Egypt. Recently, Eni, an Italian oil giant, signed a very important contract for an oil site the biggest in the Mediterranean, in Egypt. So there is an economic issue here, and no country, none of them want really to damage the business relation to that level. And then there is a security issue, because of course both Italy and Egypt have very significant interest on the Libyan case.
All right, so given those joint interests, do you think it's likely that really serious proportionate measures will be taken by the Italians?
I mean, we are in a very difficult situation because, of course, something has to be done. Somebody has to be identified and made responsible for this. But at the same time, there are significant costs on both sides.
Right.
On the Egyptian side, cost of credibility we mentioned, but also cost of support, internal support of al-Sisi. We already know, and we are noticing breaks into that kind of Egyptian establishment. But also for the Italian side, the issue is so important that really the government cannot afford to accept a low-level compromise.
Okay.
This is unacceptable for the Italian
Wafik,
government.
if go ahead, Nicholas, briefly. I could see you wanted to get in there.
So I think it's interesting that for years states have really stood by Egypt as a key security partner. And, I think what this case is showing, perhaps, is that the security forces can't tell the difference between, a peaceful dissident, a human rights worker, and, a genuine security threat. And I wonder if the international community is now going to wake up to that fact.
All right. Well, on that point, Wafik, that ties in nicely with what I was going to ask you anyway. Some of these measures which Raffaele has been talking about, possible recalling of ambassador, putting Egypt on some kind of tourism danger list. I mean, how harmful could that be to Egypt and Egypt's economy?
I think it'll be very harmful because it's the biggest challenge for the Egyptian regime. It's actually they're shocked, they cannot believe it, because they got away with murder in the past. I think there will be, in my view, two levels, either the isolation and political level of the Egyptian regime and probably some economic sanction, or even escalating the legal side probably to the international courts of justice. I think Egyptian regime is really cornered. Particularly Italy have asked for 14 names, specific names, and none of them in the current delegation in Rome. So in another level, I think as well there's a huge support in Europe. The members of European Parliament overwhelmingly condemned human rights record in Egypt, and as we know, recently Crispin Plans, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, have asked the British government not to forget the human rights abuses in Egypt.
What about the domestic situation in Egypt? I wonder how people there perceive it, Wafik. Do they rally around the government, or do they say the regime has gone too far?
I think the regime has gone too far, but the regime co-opted the media, and actually even the token opposition media are part of the regime as well. And the media playing huge, ferocious battle in supplying disinformation to the public, as the case of Regeni. They supplied so many different stories about this young man, which was all not credible. And so the judiciary as well is co-opted by the state. And they, as we know, they did help to distort the course of justice regarding the imprisonment of President Morsi in a military facility, and they advised the government to create a sort of false prison address.
All right, I'm afraid we are out of time, so we'll have to leave the discussion here. Let's thank our guests, Nicolas Piachaud, Raffaele Marchetti and Wafik Moustafa. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and on behalf of the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.